behalf of the History Department and the other sponsors of this event, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Asya Pereltsvaig and Martin Lewis, both globetrotters in their own right, and I know many of you already know them, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time up here talking about their many credentials. Asya has a PhD in linguistics from McGill. That was one of many stops on a world-circling educational tour that went from Russia to Israel to Canada to Norway to England and finally to the United States, where she's taught at Yale and Cornell before coming to Stanford. She is a linguist. She studies syntax, but she cares a lot about historical linguistics as well. And her forthcoming book, or I guess just out this year, is Languages of the World, Cambridge. Martin Lewis seems to have discovered that he likes working as part of a team. After his first two solo-authored books, Wagering the Land and Green Delusions, he has been involved in a long string of joint projects with a variety of partners. He co-authored The Myth of Continents with myself. He co-edited The Flight from Science and Reason, which was published by the New York Academy of Sciences. He's also co-authored a world geography textbook called Diversity Amid Globalization. I know there's at least one person in the room who actually teaches this book. It really kind of reinvented the genre of world regional geography by enfolding globalization into the discussion of every single world region. And most recently is signed on as the map consultant for a very new world history textbook and web project that's under development at Oxford. I would say, however, his most passionate joint project of late, is his Geocurrents blog, which he started 3 years ago on his own and was very delighted to bring Asya in as a partner about a year ago. They met in continuing studies, and how many people here met them through continuing studies? This is a very different audience than we usually have for a history presentation, I have to say. They seem to have some fans who follow them from one course to another. And Martin says, well, what we really do together is geolinguistic history or something like that. They have actually co-taught in the CS program last summer, and they're planning to do it again this coming winter on the historical geography of the world's major language families. And I know they have a lot to say, so with that, I will turn over the podium.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for coming into this stuffed room after finals are over. We're going to be talking about an article that was published in August in the journal Science, which purports to give decisive support for a theory of the origin of Indo-European languages, the world's largest language family, using Bayesio phylogeographical approaches designed to trace the diffusion of viruses. The authors claim that the Indo-European languages originated not in the steppes of north of the Black Sea, about 2000, 4000 BC, associated with horses, which is what most linguists and archaeologists think, but rather originated much earlier in Anatolia and spread with agriculture. It's nothing new. The same authors, Atkinson and Gray, have been doing this for a decade. What they have added is the geographical approach, the phylogeography. What they claim, like I say, is to have solved this problem. And immediately, the very same day of publication, the New York Times, an article authored by Nicholas Wade, former Times Science editor, again says the same thing, that they have basically solved the problem. This is a big article for the New York Times. It is one of the top 5 articles of the year in the New York Times on articles from science based on placement and word count, one of the top dozen over the last 10 years on the issue at hand. And actually, a number of these articles are by the same researchers, written by the same author, Nicholas Wade again, Atkinson and Gray, looking at, in this case, saying that languages originated in West Africa based on phonology. Other articles, other publications pick this up immediately, saying that they have pinpointed the origin of these languages, pinpointed it again, and here we have a mosque. Well, maybe there's some connection with Turkey. I'm not sure exactly what it is. Our favorite, though, is the BBC pinpointing, but Samuel Johnson here might be rather surprised to hear that the English language originated in Turkey. What we are going to say is they're not just wrong, but they're wrong at every turn, in every way, and we're just going to mention a few of the mistakes they make. Before we go into it, I just want to talk a little bit about the significance of this topic. Indo-European language is by far the world's largest language family by number of speakers and by political importance, found over much of the world. And it is ideologically freighted like nothing else. War of ideas, yes indeed, because Nazi ideology was based very heavily on the idea of the Nordics, who were the early Indo-Europeans, the so-called Nordic race. And if you think this is gone, those of us who spend a lot of time looking for images, ethnographic images and maps, are often directed by Google to the odious Stormfront website, where we see this same thing. Here it's the embattled white minority, still talking about Alpinic peoples and Nordics and the like. And in a more benign form, we find hundreds of thousands of people watching YouTube videos about Persians, the true Aryans, or Northern Indians, the true Aryans. So this Aryan stuff, it's still alive. It was, however, inverted in the 1950s and 60s by the great Lithuanian-American archaeologist Marija Gimbutas, who said that the early Indo-Europeans weren't from Germany. They were from the steppes of Ukraine, Russia, Central Asia, associated with these burial mounds called kurgans. So she came up with the kurgan hypothesis, the origination of Indo-Europeans here, subsequent spread. What she was really interested in was the pre-Indo-European culture of Europe that she called Old Europe. And she claimed that before the Indo-Europeans came in, the Old Europeans were peaceful, egalitarian, gender egalitarian, basically a really wonderful society till it was all ruined by the Kurgans who came in. A bit off the deep end with the goddesses of the ancient future, but I should say she was a great scholar, to be sure. It was followers like Rian Eisler who took this to its ultimate. And Eisler said that actually this is the problem of the world. We all would have been peaceful and gender egalitarian had it not been for the Kurgans. The fact that it's only applied to Europe, well, that was just was sort of pushed aside. Today we find the Kurgans in video games where they feed their children into pits full of starving dogs. So again, ideologically freighted, to be sure. So problematic that a lot of people wanted a way out. And one of the problems, too, was that this whole model was based on massive migrations of warlike people. And in the 1960s and 70s, this was not what archaeologists were doing. They moved from a system where everything was based on migration to where basically nothing was. And Colin Renfrew, in actually a very interesting and well-written book, claimed that all of this was wrong, that the Indo-Europeans came from simple farmers in Anatolia who just pushed out in a gradual diffusion with no real violence whatsoever. Like I say, it's an interesting book. I don't think it's right, and there's a lot of problems with it, and it's been superseded. It was written quite a while ago. But I do think that the authors of the present article have this same issue in mind. They really are so upset by the way it's been portrayed with the blood-drenched swords of the Aryans or the Kurgans, where they just want to get away from it. And actually, in an exchange on our website, one of the authors, Quentin Atkinson, went into this issue and talked about the bloody swords that he wanted to avoid. You don't have to go the bloody sword route. A couple of excellent books, Mallory's In Search of Indo-Europeans, and especially the recent Horse, the Wheel, and Language, said, we can think of it in very different ways. Probably the Indo-Europeans who originated in the steppes, horse domesticators, equestrians, they were interacting with their farming neighbors. There was raiding, there was trading, there was probably intermarriage, there was probably slavery. There were a lot of these sort of processes which would have resulted in the gradual spread of the language. We see this in many other parts of the world. And so it's actually an astounding synthesis. Anthony is an archaeologist, but he knows the linguistics upside down, and a very impressive book, won a major award. If it's still too violent for you, you can go another route. You can consider the early Indo-Europeans, if you want, as gender egalitarian proto-hippies. No, okay, you can. We don't have this information for the early proto-Indo-Europeans, but one of their immediate successor groups living in the same place with the same sort of way of life, the Scythians, we know 20% of their warrior graves were actually women. Herodotus talked about the Amazons in the region, probably for good reason. And if you want to go the proto-hippie route, well, here's Al West, a blogger. I threw in the Afghan pot farmer here. But it's pretty well known that these same Scythian, Sarmatian, early Indo-European peoples domesticated marijuana for the purposes of as a drug. Herodotus wrote about that. There's good archaeological evidence. So I think he's going a bit out on a limb here, but I found it kind of interesting. And if you do web searches of, not just marijuana, also in the Rig Veda and the Avesta, there is this drug called soma. I mean, so many of these hymns of these early Indo-Europeans who went into India singing these hymns about this drug. What was it? Was it Amanita muscaria, psychedelic mushroom? Probably ephedra, Mormon tea. Sort of an amphetamine-like substance. Aldous Huxley, of course, wrote about it in Brave New World, where soma was the drug of forced on people. And if you do a web search of soma today for images, you get things like this. So here's what I would say. If you can't take the bloody swords, well, you probably shouldn't be doing anything about human history. But you can imagine him as your early Indo-European shaman. It's no dumber than the Aryan demigod or the blood-drenched Kurgan. No better, but no worse. Anyway, Atkinson and Gray claim that they are not doing ideology here, that they are doing science. We think there's a lot of ideology behind it. We say they're doing pseudoscience. And to understand why, well, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Martin. OK, so let's try and figure out what it is that the Gray-Atkinson team does and what they think they do. So we'll start with in their own words with the abstract to this very paper we're talking about. Interestingly, they framed the debate as being between two competing hypotheses. Just as an aside, there's many more competing hypotheses, so this is something to keep in mind. In terms of the actual study that they do, they look at basic vocabulary data from 103 ancient and existing contemporary Indo-European languages. And they claim to have found decisive support for the Anatolian origin versus the steppe origin. And the Proto-Indo-European, according to them, was spoken 8,000 to 9,500 years ago. And we'll see that both the where and the when are questionable, to say the least. But let's start with what do they mean by basic vocabulary data. So they compile a huge table of words that come from a list of basic words, basic meanings, known as the Swadesh list. They use the 200-word version of it. There's another 100-word version. A modified list has 207 meanings. Basic meaning is including basic body parts like bone, blood, heart, basic animals like dog and louse. That's supposed to be a basic animal. Also natural phenomena like sun and some basic verbs like kill and others. So they have 207 meanings like this, and they look for corresponding words in 103 Indo-European languages, of which I illustrated 3 here. But the computer cannot deal with words. Computers can deal with numbers, so you have to code. And this is where a lot of problems are going to arise. How are you going to go from the actual words to numbers? So one way to code it is to look for words that appear similar, or later we'll call them cognates. And if they do, you mark them with the same number. And if they don't, you mark them 1, 2, 3, and so on. So it might not be obvious, but heart, cœur, and сердце actually come from the same common source. So we mark them all 3 as number 1. In this paper we're talking about, they actually code their words as binary. So it's either a cognate to the presumed Proto-Indo-European form, or it's not. So you make this huge chart of 1s and 0s. But it's important because they mark them as either cognates or not cognates. So what is a cognate? Or how do we decide if something is or isn't a cognate? In the paper, they basically define cognates as homologous words, just lookalikes, without excluding borrowings or just accidental lookalike words. And the fact that they have to trace to the common ancestral form is really, really crucial. And we're going to see that later. So for example, the English word knight is a cognate to the German word Knecht. They're not pronounced the same, and they don't mean exactly the same. But they do come from the same ancestral form, And we can show that by listing all the different sound changes that they've undergone. So in the case of night in particular, that changed pronunciation quite a bit. Importantly, these sound changes apply to all words in the language, not just to this one. So this is going to be, again, a crucial thing as we look at it. So now you have this mega chart of 207 meanings, 103 languages, ones and zeros for cognates or not cognates. What they do with that is feed it into a computer, which analyzes it using a Bayesian Markov chain Monte Carlo method, which is a lot of words. What it actually is the computer constructs trees that look something like this, only connecting 103 different languages. And they claim that there's more possible trees like this than there's atoms in the universe. So it's certainly a vast number of possible trees, and the algorithm computes probabilities for the different trees given the observed data, given the ones and the zeros in the table. And then the algorithm picks the best fitting tree. Here's the tree that they think is the best fitting tree, according to this paper. Now, the good news about this tree is that it gets the major Indo-European subgroupings. That's the first criterion that a good model should pass. So we have the Celtic grouping here in light green, the Italic grouping in orange, the Germanic one in red, the Balto-Slavic languages in the Iranian ones, and so on. So it does get those benchmark Indo-European subgroupings. But if we look closely at this tree, is this best tree good enough? Well, not so much, because much of this tree is invalidated by what we know from the historical record, from archaeology, from linguistic evidence, and from genetic evidence. And I'm going to mention just a few of those issues, and the ones that I'll later show you are symptomatic of bigger sort of gaps in their assumptions. So just starting close to home, English, the language that is historically the closest relative of English outside of Scots, is Frisian, but on this tree it comes out as more closely related to Dutch, from which it had a lot of influence, but it's more closely related to English. In the Romance portion of the tree, they have Romanian and the closely related Vlach as diverging first, so branching off first, whereas actually it should have diverged later, and the language that diverges first is Sardinian. And another problem here is what they do with Friulian. Friuli is just northeast of Venice, northern Italy. Friulian should be connected more closely to Ladino and Romansh, other Italian varieties in northeastern Italy. As is done on this chart, Friulian, Ladino, and Romansh, they actually show a lot in common with French and not with Italian, which is based on Tuscan dialect, which is one of the central southern dialects in Italy. The Indo-Aryan portion of the tree, there's so much wrong with this, I'm only going to mention a couple of things. They did get Assamese, Oriya, and Bengali as closely related, this cluster here. But they lost their fourth relative, Bihari, which they clustered together with Hindi, Urdu, and Landa incorrectly. What I think is the biggest gaffe here is what they do with Romani, the language of the Gypsies. They have it as diverging the earliest from the Indo-Aryan, the rest of the Indo-Aryan family. I'm going to come back to Romani in a few minutes. But I'll first talk about Slavic languages, the group that I've worked on the most. So in particular, this portion of the Slavic family, Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian are typically referred to as East Slavic languages for geographical reasons. But what happened here is Polish got somehow embedded into that East Slavic grouping. And the reason I mention in particular this problem, the Polish problem, is because I don't think it's just an error. I think it's really symptomatic of some faulty assumptions, something that's deeply flawed in the model itself, with three different faults in the model. First of all, the model fails to adequately distinguish true cognates from borrowings, because remember, true cognates descend from a same ancestral form. They're not borrowed from one language to another. The model focuses on shared retentions, As soon as you look at cognates, you look at things that are retained, that are inherited from the common proto-language, not things that have been innovated in each given language. And I'll show you in a second why it's a problem. And also, they ignore grammatical changes and sound changes, and that leads them astray in a few of these cases, and in the case of the Polish problem, too. So why is Polish grouped with these Slavic languages? I think it has everything to do with borrowing, with them not distinguishing borrowings from true cognates enough. On the one hand, there's been quite a lot of borrowings between Polish and Belarusian and Ukrainian, back and forth. So that makes them look more tightly related than they actually are. On the other hand, Russian has absorbed a lot of vocabulary from other languages other than these other three. It took a lot of vocabulary from Old Church Slavonic in the early stages, which was the liturgical language, and later also borrowed from Turkic languages and borrowed from Western European languages, a lot more than Ukrainian or Belarusian did. So that makes Russian more distinctive. Russian is pulled aside. And I'll show you an example. This is not the kind of data that Gray-Atkinson model would work with, but it will show how this kind of tree can be produced just on a different lexical set. So what we have here are names of calendar months. And you can see that Russian has a very distinctive set and looks very familiar because it's been borrowed originally from Latin through Byzantine Greek and Old Church Slavonic. And when Russia adopted Christianity, they took the calendar of the month names with it. Belarusian and Ukrainian and Polish retained the old Slavic names for their months that have to do with the climate and seasonal activities. And Luty, for example, is the freezing month. And November, Listopad, is the leaf falling month. And July is linden tree month, and so on. So they retain the old Slavic things. Now, what I did with color is to show the cognates to the items in Polish. And it's pretty easy to see that Belarusian and Ukrainian share more with Polish than Russian does. So if this is all you ever knew about these languages, it would be very easy to conclude that Belarusian and Ukrainian, will treat them together, are more closely related to Polish than they are to Russian, or that Russian is to Polish. Right? If you just share the cognates in this set, this is almost the tree you would get. Actually, you'd get Ukrainian as the closest to Polish, and not Belarusian as the Gray-Atkinson model does, but close enough. But this brings me to a bigger point, because what happened here is that Russian innovated. It did something that the other languages did not do. And that brings me to my second sort of general observation about the model, that it does not take into account that innovation in one language makes its conservative sister look like its conservative cousin, looks more closely related. So in our case, the loan words in Russian make the conservative Belarusian and Ukrainian look more like the conservative cousin Polish. Okay? And identifying loan words is sometimes easy, but sometimes it is not. It's very easy when they come from a very different language family. Then they just really stand out as the odd man out. So what I have here is some Russian words. The ones in green are very much similar to their corresponding words in other Slavic languages. But the ones I have in red here, it's very easy to see that actually they stand out. They're not anything like the Slavic words. So when it comes from a different family, it's easy to identify. But it's much harder to identify borrowings among closely related languages, sometimes impossible. But when it is possible, the things you have to look for is sound changes, sound correspondences. So what I have here is Russian and Polish, and Russian here is a representative of the whole East Slavic cluster. So Belarusian and Ukrainian work exactly the same. I didn't want to have a very clustered, busy slide here. And you can look at the parts that I've highlighted with colors. And you can see that where Russian has olo or oro, Polish has lo or ro. So there's an extra o in Russian. And this happens in all these words. And you go down to this last one, and here's something else is going on. So in this word, koromyslo, the Russian word has oro, and the Polish word has oro. So this or maybe not screaming at you, but certainly whispering at you, I am not really a Polish word, I'm an East Slavic word. I have been borrowed. And indeed it was in the 16th century. If you check it with your etymological dictionaries, that's what they would tell you. But you have to look at sound changes in order to identify these borrowings in closely related languages. And they don't do that. They don't look at sound changes. They take whatever lists they can get, they feed them in their model, but they are not going to bother to check and make sure that what they think is a cognate is really a cognate and not a borrowing. And more generally, they don't look at grammatical changes either. And I think that's really what causes this big gaffe with Romani, which they date as diverging from the rest of the Indo-Aryan tree around 1500 BCE. Whereas the more appropriate date is 2,500 years later. Yes, that's a huge gap right there. The evidence for this much later date comes from looking at grammatical changes. It has to do with transition from Middle Indo-Aryan languages to New Indo-Aryan languages. So a change that happened around this time, and in particular, a transition from a 3 grammatical gender system, like in German or Russian still today, masculine, feminine, neuter, to a 2-gender system, masculine and feminine, like Spanish or French, right? So what happened to the neuter? When neuter was eliminated, the nouns that used to be neuter had to be reshuffled into masculine or feminine gender. The crucial thing is if we compare Romani with, let's say, Hindi, the very same nouns were reshuffled to either masculine or feminine in both languages. And if this happened independently at random, it would be extremely unlikely that they would get all the same hundreds of nouns reassigned to another gender in exactly the same fashion over and over again. So the more plausible story is that the change happened once, and we can date the change by looking at written records in, say, development of Hindi. And then the languages diverge, and the Romani takes off into the sunset and then shows up in Europe 300 years later or so. But this gap we really can't account for. And by the way, there's genetic evidence that supports this date of about 1,000 years ago as well. And we can talk about that in a question period if you'd like. Generally, when we talk about dates that this Gray-Atkinson model produces, there's a lot of problems with their dates. And there's not just problems, but there's a pattern. And whenever there's a pattern, there's a reason, right? So the pattern is that the innovative languages, in this case, languages that borrowed a lot of their vocabulary, appear older. So Romani, as the gypsies made their migration from northern India to Europe, were in touch with a lot of other languages and picked up a lot of vocabulary. So that makes Romani look too old on this model. Russian, same thing. They date the divergence of Russian around 1000 CE, 1,000 years ago. Far too early. At this point, we can talk about different East Slavic tribes, different principalities, but there's no sense in which there's Russia and Ukraine and Belarus as some sort of unit, ethnic, linguistic, cultural, political, anything. It really starts happening, this divergence of Russian going one way and Ukrainian and Belarusian another way, when Lithuania and Poland get involved and start controlling what is now Belarus and parts of Ukraine. So we're talking about late 14th century at the earliest, so they are wrong about that date. On the other hand, conservative languages appear younger. And the 2 examples of sort of classical conservative languages within the Indo-European family are Icelandic and Lithuanian, for good reasons, but I won't talk about those. And they appear too young on this model by about 500 years, maybe even more, too young. And when it comes to the dating the whole Indo-European tree, there's also a dating problem here, because you'll recall that date of 8,000 to 9,500 years ago. And we think this is too old. It's too old in the sense that it predates what I call the wheel line, around 3,500 BC. This is the time when wheels and wheeled vehicles make appearance in the archaeological record in the form of drawings, toys, and actual pieces of wheels and vehicles and so on. So we can establish that the wheels appear around that time based on archaeological record, and it makes sense to think that people wouldn't have words for something they don't have or won't have for 3,000 years, right? So that's something to keep in mind. So not only is Proto-Indo-European, the root of the tree is too old, but splitting off of 4 groups, at least 4 groups here, is too old. The Anatolian languages, Tocharian, becomes Greek, and Indo-Iranian languages. Too old, before the wheel line. In what sense is it a problem? Well, these different groups of languages have roots that we can reconstruct to that ancestral Proto-Indo-European, which are listed here. So Queclaws gave us the word wheel. It's not obvious how that happened, but it did, and we can show how it happened step by step through looking at those sound changes. We could do the same thing for Indo-Iranian, Tocharian words. I'll set aside Anatolian and Greek because they only have 1 or 2, but Indo-Iranian and Tocharian have 5. So that makes it very unlikely that this is accidental. So how come they got those 5 vehicular words? A number of scenarios sort of allow for the Gray-Atkinson model. Under these scenarios, these languages acquired these words after they split from Proto-Indo-European somehow. Either they made them up, or they repurposed old words to now mean wheels and so on, or they borrowed them from other Proto-Indo-European, for other Indo-European languages. The first 2 are not very likely because we can actually trace all of those steps, all of those sound changes. So that would be very clever linguistic engineering if they made up those 5 words to confuse us. The borrowing story is not very likely because look at where the Gray-Atkinson model has Tocharians and Indo-Iranians. At the time, this is 33 BCE, around the time of the wheel line. They're thousands of miles away from their Indo-European speaking brethren. They're on the other side of the Caspian, which runs up to here, and there's some formidable mountains. And there's also linguistic evidence which suggests that once they took off, they never looked back. They never borrowed much from other Indo-European languages. So the borrowing story is unlikely. The only scenario that actually is plausible is that these languages inherited those words from Proto-Indo-European, made all the changes along the way, and that makes Proto-Indo-European spoken after the wheel line because it needed to have those vehicular words in the first place, and they wouldn't have had the words if they didn't have the wheels to call by these words. So that means that the model is just simply wrong for that reason too. So what we need to do here, sort of if you think about it graphically like I do, is take this whole tree and kind of squish it so it fits all on the right side of the wheel line. Right? Everything that happens to the left of it here happens to the right of it. And how we can do this? Well, this brings us to what we think is the biggest problem, the biggest sort of wrong assumption that goes into this model. And the assumption is that language spread can be modeled solely as spatial diffusion. The paper actually makes an explicit caveat that they're not going to model the rapid expansion of a single language. They're not going to model cases where a group takes off and goes from A to B without sort of gradually diffusing over centuries and millennia. Like what happened to Latin. It spread over a vast territory pretty quickly. In this sense, and not just any random territory equally in all directions, as diffusion would have it. It was the territory of the Roman Empire, or sort of the core of the Roman Empire, where it spread. And such examples are really too common and too important for us to ignore, not just of Indo-European languages that spread quickly like this, but non-Indo-European languages too, like Hungarian, which sort of created a gap in what is otherwise Indo-European speaking area. So we need a different mechanism. We need something else besides diffusion. We need something that goes not at random in all directions, kind of you wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to go somewhere, where am I going to go? We need something that's a lot more directed, something that has preferential directions. And the mechanism for that is advection. So here's the term. So if you think about dropping paint in the standing water of a lake or a pool, it's going to diffuse gradually through the water. But if you throw paint in a river, it's going to be carried with a stream. Well, that's advection. And we want this kind of a mechanism for population spread as well. And by the way, rivers facilitate migrations, and anyone who's ever worked on migrations knows that it's easier to travel by boat or somehow along the river than to walk the same distance by foot, carrying all your stuff. So this, I'm not going to go through all the technical aspects of this formula, but you can ask me in the question period. But this is from a very interesting paper by Kate Davison and colleagues from University of Newcastle. What they model is population spread of the Neolithic farmers from, or rather through Anatolia. The very same folks whom Gray-Atkinson model has as the carriers of Indo-European languages. It's published 6 years prior to this paper in Science that we're talking about, and they make no reference to it, interestingly. But they do model the spread of these Neolithic farmers by using both diffusion and advection. And let me show you what difference advection makes. So this model is just diffusion without advection. The model population expansion starting in Jericho, and you can see isochrones of how population proceeds. They run perpendicular to this blue line, which is the Danube-Rhine corridor, which is going to be important in a second. And let's see how long it takes to go from Jericho to Kent in southeastern England. 6,000 years. Diffusion only. Diffusion is slow. Now what they say, oh, but it's much easier to travel along Danube or Rhine, so let's throw in advection along the riverways. And they get a very different result, much more in line with archaeological dates. And the result they get is here. So now the isochrones are parallel to the river. So you take a boat up the river, or down the river, and then diffuse away from the banks. But interestingly, advection has an effect not only locally along the rivers that they model it with, it has repercussions to the whole model. Because now from Jericho to Kent takes us 2,500 years. We more than halved the time that it takes for that population expansion to happen. So the take-home message is advection gets you there faster, and it has a global effect, and it can account for population migrations that are along direct, preferential directions. Interestingly, this Davison paper does what the Buchert paper claims they do, which is to provide a feature-rich geographical model. They actually take into account the difference not only between land and water, but they make a difference between rivers or coastlines and deep seas. Deep seas are much harder to navigate than traveling along the shore. It makes sense. But they put it into the model. They account for altitude, so mountains are harder to live in and harder to travel through than lowlands. Latitude, which they use as proxy for climatic severity, and deserts. And I'm going to turn over to Martin to talk about other geographical issues here.
Yes, they claim, the article we're critiquing, the authors claim they have a geographically rich model. Look how they handle the movement of the Tocharians. These are Indo-Europeans who lived in the Tarim Basin of China for a long period of time. Here's where those basins are. Here's how they have them moving up along the Tian Shan Mountains at 25,000 feet above sea level. So they're obviously not taking into account mountains or anything. All they take into account is water and land. And the way they take into account is they say that it's going to take 100 times more time over water than over land, although they actually have several different models. They have one model where it's only 10 times, and they have what they call the Sailor model, where it's the same amount of time. In practice, what does this mean? We're moving insular North Germanic towards Iceland. We are here in 909 CE at the Faroe Islands. About 100 years later, we're halfway to Iceland. Literally, they're sitting in their boats, and on any given day or any given time, they will move 1 pixel north or east or west. Actually, they can't go northwest or southwest. They have to go north and then the other way. That's how the model works. And then finally, another 50 years, they actually reach Iceland. That's how the feature-rich model works. And we see how they model it. They never get to Corsica. They never get to Gotland. They never get to the Balearic Islands because it's hard to cross water in their model. You don't just get in a boat and sail across. You don't explore. You don't do anything like that. Other oddities. Here's Moldova. No Indo-European in Moldova? How could that be? Here is the Ukraine and what is now Kazakhstan, where the Scythians lived. This is not there. Here's a real oddity. I don't know if anyone can know what's going on here. This is the Fergana Valley, and we have Indo-Europeans in the Tajikistan portion of the Fergana Valley and not in the Uzbekistan portion. These are things that just scream out to a geographer as some sort of problem. We have Neolithic Indo-European settlements and later ones all over the Sahara, all over Arabia. Real problems here. The cornerstone of this model is what they call a movie. It's a map animation that shows their model in action, where we have contours showing 95% probability of Indo-European speaking, and these lines show all of the different families. I mean, that's the first thing that struck us is here's Russia not within the Indo-European zone. I mean, how could that be? And actually, one of the authors responded to us, and he said, oh, well, this is 1974. That just meant that Russia, Indo-European didn't come into Russia after that date. That's all we're saying. We're not saying very much in that case. Notice we do have Indo-European speakers in Tibet, though, in a much earlier period. How did they get this odd geography? Well, they'd mapped 103 languages, modern languages and extinct languages. At one point, Atkinson said we mapped all the Indo-European languages, which is kind of crazy. But if you see here, the extinct ones are in red, the extant ones are in blue. Notice they just left out Moldova. I mean, there's actually no real Moldovan language. It's just Romanian. They call it a different language, but it's the same. They just sort of forgot it, I suppose. Oddities everywhere. Note there are 3 Swedish languages with a nice straight line here in Sweden. We have Cornish, which has been extinct for a couple hundred years. We have 3 Breton languages. We have 4 Albanian languages, but we didn't manage to get northern Albania within that Albanian group. We have total coincidence of modern states like Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland with those languages, even though in actuality the political boundaries and the language boundaries don't correspond, and to the extent they do, it's because of genocide and ethnic cleansing in the 20th century. What I've done with this map is I've broken it and I've isolated 103 errors, and I stopped at 103 because that's how many languages they had. And I'm not going to go through all of these. Now, here's ancient Greek just in Attica, nowhere else. Modern Greek we have in Greek, and then we have a different language in Lesbos. So there's a Lesbian Greek, which is a different language. We have Romani in a tiny little area in Bulgaria, and that's it, because they can't deal with languages that are not contiguous. So anyway, the problems are here, there, and everywhere. Here's some examples from another area. So again, here's their map, and I'm showing errors. And here's this oddity here, which is Tajikistan. They've mapped Tajik as virtually entirely coincident with the country of Tajikistan. What does that reflect? Soviet geo-ethnic machinations, because before the Soviets came in, there were a bunch of Persian speakers. Tajik is a form of Persian. And there were a bunch of people who spoke Turkic languages that were heavily personified. And the Soviets made them decide, are you Uzbek or are you Tajik? And even to this day, cities like Samarkand and Bukhara are Persian or Tajik speaking. They left all the Persian out of Afghanistan as if it doesn't even exist. So what do we do? We're mapping geopolitical units, not language units. And we're mapping them anachronistically. Here's what could this line be here, if anyone can see that line? It took me a while to figure it out. That's Kurdish. Actually, there's no single Kurdish language. Sorani and Kurmanji are as different as French and Italian. Zaza and Gorani are related. We've taken some of these, and there's some other Kurds over here. So what they've done is they've gerrymandered it to fit. I love this shape. It reminds me of a lounging rodent, but if you put it on its side, you get a running dinosaur, which maybe is even better. So, pretty extreme gerrymandering here. With Vedic Sanskrit, so that's the outline there. I looked at that, and the familiar shape, what is that? That is Punjab under the Brits before partition, and it goes up to the Himalayan crest. It has nothing to do with Vedic Sanskrit. It was just a convenient way to do it, but again, it's a modern geopolitical issue. The biggest problem, though, is up in the steppe zone here. Nothing. Well, what you actually have, Scythian was an Indo-European language. Well, probably many languages. All we know is personal names and a few inscriptions. Because we know so little about Scythian, they left it out. With ancient languages, they just chose those Indo-European languages that are well recorded. This is preservation bias to an extreme. So Thracian, left out. Illyrian, left out. Sarmatian and all the Scythian languages. Sogdian, that's well known. They left it out, I think, simply because it was inconvenient for their model. And this alone falsifies what they're doing, because if you're going to take out this huge zone of ancient Indo-European languages and wipe them off of your model is not going to reflect the geographical realities there. Another problem, which if we had time would go into, is the Uralic issue. Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Uralic borrowed heavily from early and Proto-Indo-European. We know that from linguistic evidence. And if the early Proto-Indo-Europeans were down here, how would they be interacting with the Uralics up in the Ural mountain range? Virtually impossible. I'll go through now a few of the frames of their movie, their animated map, to show some of these other problems. 3000 BC here, we have Greek and Albanian, which they regard as a language family. Pretty hard to do that. Arriving in Greece. And then 1,500 years later, starting to diverge, Greek on one hand and Albanian on another. All kinds of problems here. Albanian, probably a descendant of Illyrian, which they ignore because it's not well recorded. One thing that makes Greek distinctive is because it has a huge substrate of non-Indo-European words. And guess what? Those words are words for Mediterranean agriculture, for building, for statescraft. According to this model, you had farmers crossing the Aegean Sea, coming into an area of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and they're borrowing words for agriculture from those hunter-gatherers. They have the same problem with Armenian, probably the same problem with Germanic, and same problem with the Indic languages. But if you just trace this out, I should say, Greek and Albanian just sit there for millennia, and then about 1300 CE in the modern era, they finally begin to diverge spatially. Albanian starts moving towards Albania. It finally reaches Albania 1500, and 1800 it's finally crossed the sea because there are some Albanian communities in Sicily. That totally goes against the geographical and historical record. We know this is just nonsense. One more example here I'll have with the Romance languages. We know how the Romance languages developed. That's all historically well recorded. But remember, they don't allow the single rapid movement of a language. So here, they're not going to have Latin moving with the Roman language. It just can't work for their model. So instead, you have about 220 BCE, you have the Italic group starts to diverge. And the latter part of the Roman Empire, they're really starting to move. In other words, the Romance languages are originating in Italy and spreading outwards. 380 CE, still in the Italian peninsula. 610, one branch is going over. That's going to become Romanian and Vlach. This is going to become Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, French, and Walloon, which are the 5 languages they count. 900, finally, coming close to Spain. Italian is finally diverging. French group, no single languages, so French is French and Walloon together. 1300 is finally starting to diverge there as well. And what's interesting, 1900, Sardinian finally reaches Sardinia. Sardinian is the oldest of the Romance languages. Sardinian was conquered by the Romans in the First Punic War, and Sardinian has a large non-Indo-European substrate. It is old, but yet their model has it as the most recent one. And also, where are we getting? Oh, we're finally reaching Portugal at about this time. We have 9 authors. They've been, at least Gray and Atkinson, have been working on this for a decade. Major grants, peer review from Science. This is what we get. I mean, would say it's an unfalsifiable computational method of generating error. I don't think it rises to the level of creationism. Okay, that panel is a little bit naive, but I think this panel is pretty much spot on. Creationists at least will deal with facts. Dinosaurs, yeah, well, they coexisted with early people. Nonsense, but they're not ignoring it. What these authors are doing is simply ignoring these errors. A few facts to construct the model, otherwise facts are just noise. I think it's a pathological form of rationalism or anti-empiricism. I think it's based on mindless assumptions, sort of meta-assumptions. They never say, we're assuming that languages diffuse like viruses. It's a pre-assumption. And ultimately, I think this is an example of what my colleagues Robert Proctor and Lana Schiebinger have called agnotology, the creation of ignorance, where people, under the guise of science, are creating a kind of pseudoscience which actually undermines our knowledge. And it is, I think, a problem. A few more words from Asya, and then we'll go on to questions.
Well, it is indeed a problem, and having all of you in this room is a testimony how much interest in the human past there is, both in academia and with general public. The problem is that this kind of pseudoscience leads us astray. And as Brad Kessler put very nicely in this quote I have on the slide, for this convergence of different disciplines to work, each discipline should do its own homework, should do its own contribution. The problem is that historical linguistics, as of late, has been languishing. 200 years ago, historical linguistics was it. It was the linguistics. Now, look at how little room there is for historical linguistics. It's striking. This chart shows the number of PhD dissertations from 2009 to 2012 in blue, and orange is the jobs in the different subfields. Historical linguistics is a tiny little subfield compared to both fashionable things like computational linguistics. It's very popular now, but even core subfields like phonetics and phonology. And if we go beyond 2009, here I have jobs going all the way to 2002 yearly. You can see this is nothing new. Historical linguistic jobs, very far and few, as compared to both computational and phonetics and phonology. And I looked at some rankings of what is considered to be best programs in linguistics. And between the top 10 programs, there's only 9 faculty members who say, I'm a historical linguist. And 3 of them are in the same institution. Only 24 graduate students declare themselves as being historical linguists. And all of them in only 2 of the 10 institutions. And how can you become a historical linguist? Look at what they have for courses. 10 programs. 10 undergraduate courses on the books, not necessarily taught every year, and 6 graduate courses, never more than 1, and some programs don't have a single course. How can you become a historical linguist? So historical linguistics has been languishing as a discipline, and we think this is really a problem. But we'll also see another sort of angle to this issue, and why we really got so excited about this project and wanted to do this talk. And this has to do with what we call lodged fallacies. And as linguist Jeffrey Pullum puts it very nicely, once the public decides to accept a certain fact or a certain idea, it's very hard to undo that myth. And he talks about what he calls the great Eskimo vocabulary hoax. And I think you heard some form of this, that the Eskimo language has 50, 100, and it's like an auction, right? Whoever's going to give more words for snow. Well, it's not true. Well, first of all, it's not the Eskimo language. It's a number of different languages, and if you add it up, it's not fair. It started as sort of a very tentative comment that maybe Eskimo has 4 roots for different kinds of snow, and then was picked up by Benjamin Lee Whorf of the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis fame. And he says, well, he lists different ones as other kinds, so at least 8 different words apparently Eskimo is supposed to have for snow. And the beast is out. And look at what New York Times has reported. 1984, in an editorial, 100 words for snow. It's a nice round number. Why not? They don't give you any dictionary, references to dictionaries that would list them. 4 years later, to the day, the science section decided to ask more than half of those supposed Eskimo words for snow. We're down to 4 dozen. That's why 48. And it's never supported by any factual evidence. It's just whatever number you care to make up. Even if it were true, it's not such an interesting point, because if you stop and think about English, English has snow, but also slush, slop, sleet, blizzard, avalanche, and so on and so forth. And if you're a skier, then it's even more. Right? And other languages do too. So that's not really a very interesting point. So I'll just sort of conclude with this cartoon that summarizes it nicely. We'll interview some of you here and see how many words we can get. So, well, we hope that we've dislodged a fallacy or 2 here today. And we'll continue to do so in the course that Martin and I are offering in Stanford's continuing studies in the winter. called The History and Geography of Language Families. Indo-European will feature prominently, I think, but other families are going to make appearance as well. So thank you very much for coming, and sorry you had to sit in such tight conditions.
How do you account for this lack of interest in historical linguistics and the relatively higher level of interest in those other fields? Number one, I have a second question about those the words that came into Greek that are not Indo-European. Where do they come from?
I'll take the Greek one first. It's not really sure, but on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean, there was a non-Indo-European language spoken all the way until the Athenian conquest after the Persian War. And the Greeks attributed, I mean, they talked about the pre-Greek inhabitants. There may have been a language family called Terensian, which would have included Etruscan, Rhaetic in the Alps. But so little is known about it, it's hard to reconstruct. But it was probably the farmers in Greek, the early agricultural settlers had probably a number of different languages in this language family. Indo-Europeans came down about probably 2000 BCE with their Indo-European language. And then those languages, to a certain extent, emerged, although the Indo-European was the dominant group. You want to?
Yeah, I'll briefly answer the question about the role of historical linguistics. Well, we don't know for sure what happened, and we haven't traced it back to, its glory days to see when it happened. But I think there's several reasons. I think that historical linguistics, like other fields, but maybe even more so, became very specialized. So the general public and people in other disciplines cannot really sort of communicate with historical linguists as well as they should. And also, I think from what I've shown you, it's a self-perpetuating system. It's sort of a vicious circle. There are no students, there's no faculty hired to teach students, there's less courses, there's less interest. It's sort of a self-perpetuating system.
Other problem, they have their heads in the sand. It's no coincidence that almost all the people with these grand syntheses are archaeologists, because the linguists say, oh, if you're not dealing with nitty-gritty linguistic work, you're not doing anything. We know a young historical linguist, brilliant young man, can't get a job, probably going to leave academia, and he tells us, oh, why are you working on this? You're beating a dead horse. Well, meanwhile, this horse is galloping. It's a zombie horse, I suppose, but he doesn't have a job, he's never going to get one, and he thinks we're wasting our time talking about this. I don't understand. Like I said, I'll start with the front, Robert.
I loved your talk. It reminds me a little bit of the early days of AIDS, when there was this notion that the risk factor was being Haitian or being homosexual. And Peter Gould published his Geography of AIDS, where he showed that in Thailand and other places, AIDS was flowing up the highways. And you could much more accurately model by the actual sort of motions of trucks through prostitutes than abstractly whether you were Haitian or not. But what I wanted to actually ask you is, are there any things that this computational linguistics model has discovered that were new, that were subsequently verified by historical linguistics?
Well, there's a lot of things that are new in the sense that they've not been discovered before. The problem is it's very difficult to know what is correct because we don't know the answer. And if we did know the answer, we wouldn't need the model, right? So it's a bit sort of tricky how we validate the model. It has a hard time discovering things that we do know. And Martin mentioned the paper that was published in Nature in 2003 by the same team. They had a different tree, but they had some of the same errors. They had different errors. They didn't have some of these, but it sort of like evens out. It didn't get any better over almost 10 years.
So there's not a big discovery you can name of something that was then verified historically by these?
Well, their biggest discovery is really the Anatolian theory, but that was known before. It was one of the theories that was proposed by archaeologists before, and there's no sense in which it now has been proven in any way.
We have nothing against computational linguistics at all in the abstract, and I think it can be done well. I think people have certainly, Joanna Nichols and others have done a pretty good job of it. It's this particular case that we're focusing on. What do you want to call it?
First of all, I want to thank both of you for coming here and talking. It reminded me of the days when I was studying linguistics on my own, and sometimes if I ran a different life, I might have become a historical linguist. But I do want to ask you something about the peer review, because I noticed that this is published in Science, one of the leading scientific journals. So I was wondering, how a study like this got through the peer review, without any, actual, well, first of all, were there any actual linguists or historians, on board the peer review? And if there were, I mean,
Yeah. We don't know for sure because peer review process is supposed to be blind both ways, and we don't know. Actually, there was an earlier paper by Atkinson published also in Science, and I co-authored a response with Rory, who's there in the audience. And we know what kind of peer review science gives you. For a 1,000-word technical comment response to an earlier paper, we went through 2 rounds of peer review. So at least on the surface, they do serious peer review. The question is, did they have a linguist? I doubt it, given what came out, right? Even if they had linguists, did the authors actually respond to the comments before paper was published? I doubt it, because there's so much things that linguists just wouldn't let through to be published.
And don't we know from Language Log that early phonological article actually went to a linguist for review, and he wrote on Language Log that all of his suggestions were ignored. So that we do know. We'd love to know more about this. We'd have to become
Private
investigators to do so, I suppose.
Okay.
I'm trying to tie the errors in the model that you've shown back to the conclusion that Indo-European originated in Turkey. Are you saying that if you take various different possible locations that Indo-European originated and run it through their erroneous model, the one that matches closest to what we see today is the Anatolian origin?
What we would love to do is to take their model and actually change those maps. For example, bring in the Scythians and the Sarmatians and all these, and see if you get the same sort of thing. I mean, I don't have a great stake in the Kurgan hypothesis that puts it in the Pontic steppes, but people I really trust who have really done the research argue that that is the most likely case, and I'm following their works, especially David Anthony and J.P. Mallory. I mean, it seems to work pretty well. But that's really not what we're arguing about. We're arguing about this particular work.
Yes, and if I can add something to that, I think we don't necessarily say here that the Anatolian model is definitely wrong. What we say is that we see no good reason to believe that this model actually proves that.
Okay.
Yes.
So the presentation is absolutely compelling to someone who knows absolutely nothing about the subject.
Thank you.
I haven't seen a retraction on page 2 of the New York Times. So what's going on?
You want to take that?
Well, yeah, I don't think you're going to see it. Nicholas Wade, who wrote that article in the New York Times, does not have a very high opinion of historical linguistics at all. He really does think that this sort of scientific approach from virology or whatever is the way to go. We sort of have anecdotal evidence of this, nothing that we can really put in print. We've put a lot of this on our blog site. We're going to keep writing on it. We've been talking to publishers. Maybe a book will come out of this. Maybe then they'll pay some attention. Yes, Bert?
I think you'll find, if you go back into the history of universities and academia, that the rise of a certain grammatical linguistics located with and affiliated with philosophy and around a notable intellect, Noam Chomsky, will partly explain the decline of historical linguistics, where, frankly, the folks did not look conceptually as smart. They tended to do more narrow work. They didn't have a reach beyond what they were doing. And the linguistics of philosophy, with associations with people like Klein and Ryle and others, had a magisterial reach by very smart people. So I don't think it's it may be a lament, but it shouldn't be a surprise. But I think this is possible to do by probably looking at 10 departments over 40 years and doing something systematic and simple-minded, like charting the numbers of faculty who increase from one specialty and not the others. But the larger set of questions I wanted to raise is that I think that in critiquing what you've critiqued, you really have to step back and tell us what are the conceptual underpinnings that are essential to their model and argument, because part of the critique was one where you were so delighted by hotshots of destruction that it tended not to distinguish between things essential and things correlative, but probably not in the logic. You have to construct their logic, tell us what it is, what the 4 or 5 central underpinnings are, and why all of some of those underpinnings fail. Because otherwise, it's kind of taking buckshot, and you're hitting mostly antelope, but you're hitting a lot of walls along the way where the holes are interesting, but they don't lead really to the argument. On particular pieces, you started out in the chart with 207 characters, which you converted into meanings without explaining why. I'm not sure whether characters and meanings mean the same thing or whether it's a slippery on screen or slippery orally. You talked about Frisian, which it didn't seem to me was central, but there is an ambiguity between the Frisia of Caesar's Frisia, which is really a part of the area of the Old Netherlands, and the Frisia of the Frisian Islands of Amrum, etc., in the North Sea, somewhat off the coast of Hamburg. So when they're talking about Frisia and you're talking about Frisia, you may be talking about the same place, or you may not. It's really hard to tell. When you move to the issue of cognates and borrowing, it was unclear whether this is the way they define cognates as not including borrowing, or whether this was your stipulative definition to clarify matters. I think there's a crucial distinction, but it was hard to tell whom you were representing. And it does seem to me that in the case of science and nature, that is, I think amalgamating this to the times is culturally interesting, but conceptually mushy. Which is to say that the Times gets something wrong, means somebody reads Nature or Science, summarizes it, doesn't know the rest of the literature. You know, Nicholas Wade does swine flu 1 month, this another week, A-bombs when Bill Broad's not doing it and other stuff. And you're really asking those science journalists to have a reach that nobody can have, and one should lament the errors, but not be shocked at it. It's inherent in science journalism. And if you move to other areas, you'll see similar things happening. Whether there's malfeasance, I doubt. Whether there's undue spread, I suggest.
I don't think there's any way to justify a headline in the BBC saying English language originated in Turkey. I think you do have an important point about science journalism. But journalists still have some obligation to be critical of what they read, but they have more importantly, they have an obligation to try to be dispassionate and to be objective to the extent they can. And when Nicholas Wade puts that article in the A section of the New York Times on the very day that Science publishes this, after he's been writing article after article, trumpeting Atkinson and Gray, I think that's malfeasance. So I disagree with that assessment.
The A section, he pleads with the editors and they place it. Everybody there wants to be in the A section.
Oh, no doubt. Okay, well then it goes higher up the chain. Yeah. Now you've made a lot of comments, and would like to respond to a few of them because we have plenty of other questions. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. The assumptions behind the article, yes, if we would have had more time, we would have gone through them in a much more systematic. But the frustrating thing is they don't lay out their assumptions. Like I said, they're sort of meta-assumptions. They're never saying, we are assuming that language is going to spread like a virus. Yeah, language spreads in many different ways. Sometimes it spreads because people spread. Sometimes it spreads because people are converted to another language. More often, you have one group of people coming into another group of people. You have extensive bilingualism, and then you have some sort of synthesis after that. Many different ways of language spread. They're not talking about any of that. So that's why I think these are sort of meta-assumptions. And the other point is, that's what they've said in response. Quentin Atkinson said, you're just intolerant of error. Of course we're going to make some mistakes. But if we can show that everything that they're showing on their maps is in error, then the cumulative effect of that, I think, is overwhelming. And I don't think it's just pot shots. If we can do it again and again and again and again, we've just shown you a few. I can go through all of those phylogeographical lines that they've put on their map and show that none of them match the historical record. I think that's significant.
Yeah, just a quick response to that question about cognates and characters versus meanings. Character is a technical term for anything we're going to compare across languages, so it can be a particular meaning. So we're going to look for just sort of words. We can look for specific morphemes. We can look for structural patterns, syntactic patterns, and so on. So characters is more general. Meaning is just, well, in this particular work, since they only look at lexical items, this is what they're going to look at. When it comes to cognates, it gets kind of mushy because the definition of cognate that it has to exclude borrowing is a very well-accepted definition, and the definitions I had on the slide, they're from introductory textbooks. So this is not a highly guarded secret in linguistics what a cognate is. However, when they define it, they say, well, we exclude borrowings. But when you look at the errors that come out, it looks like they don't exclude them enough. So they seem to think they know what borrowings are, but it doesn't come through when the model is applied.
Yes, thanks. Mikhail?
Yeah, I was really fascinated by this talk, and as a historian, but not as a linguist. I was wondering if you see any parallels between the sort of computational turn in linguistics and sort of the slow demise of historical linguistics with the mathematical turn in economics after the Second World War. I mean, particularly since economics as a so-called science was not around, really prior to World War II, and the 19th century came out of political economy, which saw economics and politics, therefore society as inseparable in some way or another. I mean, do you see this trend kind of following a similar path, and if so, what will be the consequences?
No, I think there are a lot of similarities, although again, I'd say we're not arguing against computational linguistics. The notion
I wouldn't argue against mathematical
right, but the notion that you can treat language as if it were a virus. And if you can treat geography as if it's an isotropic plane, uniform in all directions. Oh, except there's land and water. Yeah, these are very familiar things. They're familiar to me not so much from economics, but from geography. Because in the 1960s, geography had what was called the quantitative revolution. They tried to salvage the discipline by turning it into a positivistic social science.
For a slide that you probably want for that.
Actually, I had a slide on this. But one of the key theories of the time was called central place theory. And central place theory said, we can explain all the patterns of settlement and urbanization based on marketing behavior, and we're going to get these hexagonal patterns. It's going to be universal. It's going to be non-historical. In a way, it's anti-geography, because what makes geography interesting is differences from place to place. Here they're assuming there are no differences. Everything is the same, and you can deduce this sort of thing. So I think this is the same kind of hyper-rationalist, anti-empiricist thought that underlies the Gray-Atkinson approach to language. I wouldn't argue that for computational linguistics in general, but I would for this article. I think...
Asya, I'm very sorry, but because we're so packed in here that people can't even leave if they need to, I'm going to intervene to draw this to an end, but I want to say there are beverages, including wine and beer, in the faculty lounge around the corner, room 302. I have a key, and I'm going to go open that up. Anybody who would like to stay and speak with the speakers, please do. But meanwhile, please join me in giving them a round of applause.